Hiya community. Justice here. I thought I might as well speak with you because it's been about a week and I like to try to be consistent with our communication. I just drank a cup of coffee. It's about 6 p.m. It's after 6 p.m. now, my time. So I've got my synapses are firing a little bit. And this is something that I like to talk about a lot because of the line of work that I'm in. One of the things that I help people process is abuse and trauma. And one of the words that we use to describe the elicitation very often of this processing is trigger. So, what is a trigger? And what do we do with them, right? I'm going to turn the vibrator off on this thing for a second. Okay, here we go. Okay. So, what is a trigger and what do we do with them? How do we become aware of them? So, a trigger is very often it's a visceral reaction that our body has to stimulation. That stimulation could be interacting with another person. That could be something that we read online. That could be something that we're watching on TV. Almost always. And it can be, I was going to say, it's almost always something coming from the outside and internal to external interaction. But that's not necessarily true because we can certainly trigger ourselves also in our own minds. And once we become accustomed, particularly with the involved psychoneuroimmunology, to feeling a certain way, to holding a certain state, it's not uncommon that we will activate triggers, even internally, mentally, to sort of keep that state self-generating. And it's not necessarily a state that we want to be in, but it could be a state that's familiar. For me, I will relate this to my own kind of adrenaline addiction. And I use the term addiction as a means of sort of just creating a context for it, right? What is an addiction? One of the terms for addiction, or one of the definitions that Gabor Mate uses, is that it is any habit that is used to soothe discomfort or pain that creates a long-term problem. Basically, it creates more problems over the long term than it does than it solves. Okay, so we have a term for addiction. We have sort of what a trigger is. It's either an internal or external play that is having an effect on our biology, and very often a hormonal response. Adrenaline, norepinephrine is a common hormonal combination that gets activated when we're triggered. And then very often, we'll look to soothe, to kind of create, to sort of regulate those conditions by doing something that either gives us the opportunity to discharge that energy, or that sort of gives our brain kind of a flood of dopamine. So sort of going through and trying to find a way to soothe ourselves, essentially. So what we have is we have a series of internalized reactions that are both biochemical, emotional, and physiological, because there's a whole physiology that goes along with being triggered. And if you think about this, like when you read something that's upsetting, or when someone says something to you that is that's unnerving, like you can notice that your body goes through a certain process with that. So what might that be? It might be that you notice that you flush. You may get like a burst of anger, a sense of fear. You may notice that your body tenses. Very often, if you watch a person who's being triggered, like their pupils will dilate. They will essentially, from a physiological standpoint, they will go into what is called fight or flight mechanism. So they go from parasympathetic and rest and digest mode to survival mode, essentially. Because when we're triggered, we don't feel safe. So whatever your go-to is when you don't feel safe is likely the kind of mode that's going to set in when you get triggered. And there's the freeze component of that as well. And then from a psychological standpoint, there's fawning or people pleasing. So if you tend to get triggered and your sort of go-to fight or flight reaction is to run away, then you're likely going to want to flee. You're going to want to move away from whatever is triggering you. If you tend to get triggered and your go-to when you're threatened is to fight back, you're likely going to want to you're going to want to confront, you're going to want to fight, you're going to be that keyboard warrior like talking shit on the internet. Or you're going to be that person who's getting in other people's face. If you tend to freeze, you're probably going to shut down. And this is a really common response. This is a more common response than people realize. That feeling of shutting down is, it's neurological, it's emotional, and it's physiological, where whatever other response we might want to take in that situation, our sort of safety override kind of kicks in, and we don't wind up doing or saying any of the things that we might otherwise do. Freeze is, from a processing standpoint, actually the hardest one to come out of, because if we move away, then we tend to discharge that energy and also the hormones. If we confront or we attack back, we fight back, we also will be more inclined to discharge that energy and also those hormones, particularly from a physical standpoint. If we're out in the wild and we're interacting with someone, the freeze response is the one that tends to hold things inside of us, and is the one that typically tends to also sort of freeze the response in our physical tissue. And I think from that standpoint, when that, who is it? Peter Levine, different trauma guides have talked about this. From that standpoint, when we freeze, we also don't properly process the hormones that are being released in anticipation for needing to take action. So those also stick in our body. So these responses, these reactions to trauma that also become, that sort of tie in with our trigger responses later in life, or even earlier in life, they have a physical impact on our body, particularly from the standpoint of the psychoneuroimmunology, is that the neurons create a thought loop, the body experiences a physical process, and the hormones get tied in with sort of locking that state in place. So processing, the kind of emotional processing that actually leads to resilience is moving enough into a state of discomfort, and very often intentionally calling up an unpleasant experience or an unpleasant memory, and allowing our body and sensations to help us move through that. So one of the things that I will do with clients is when they want to work on a pattern, on a situation, something that they want to move through, a habit, an addiction, whatever kind of neuroses it is we'll pause and we'll take a moment and a breath to feel where that is happening in the body. So I'll walk through my own process with this. I have been feeling triggered around a social and relational concept, the concept of commitment. So when I think of commitment, I neurologically allow myself to just go into a free association. What comes up for me? I was surprised the other day when what came up for me was like essentially a cage. Like, commitment means falling in line with someone else's agenda and climbing into a cage. Like, my body has a visceral reaction to that concept and how it's been encoded in my with the psychoneuroimmunology of that. So for me, in the past, when I've made commitments, particularly romantic commitments, relationship commitments, I have latched onto the idea, to the construct of what commitment was, and I have sort of overridden both my instincts, my intuition, and the more subtle sensations that were playing out in my body that were trying to guide me in a direction that was better suited for me. So what's happened over time is this bizarre sort of fusion with this concept of commitment, sort of leading to feeling unsafe and restrained and numbed out. So when I bring this sensation up in my body with this association, I want to feel into my body and I want to notice what I notice. I notice a tensing around my jaw. This for me is almost always an indication that there's something that I want to say. For me, in the realm of commitment, like putting my own needs down, prioritizing the other person, has always been something of sort of this engaging in this caging of myself process. So it doesn't surprise me that I feel this sort of physical sensation in my jaw. Okay. The other thing that I notice is like there's tensing around my tailbone. I notice there's tension in my shoulders. There's tension in my neck. My body has a really intense kind of visceral reaction to this concept because it's not just conceptual, it is lived context for me. So this is something that we want to understand, especially with these bigger sort of social archetypal ideas that actually do become lived context, is like, you're not just dealing with an idea of something, you're dealing with an archetype, really, to a large degree. And when we're dealing in the realm of archetypes and symbols, that is going to hits below our conscious level of thought process, and that actually directly impacts our body. So most people aren't aware of how sort of infiltrated into the archetypes really are, and symbols as well. Even the words that we use are symbols for energies and experiences, and concepts. So like, from one standpoint, everything that we're dealing with is archetypal, and in that way, like, everything that is archetypal is having and is playing out on our subconscious and is playing out through our body. So when we're getting kind of triggered by these concepts that we're either sharing relationally with people, or that we're seeing like in the social media scene, or that we're seeing like in our actual life, we are dealing with more than like the top layer of the conversation at hand. We're dealing with these sort of innate symbols that are embedded in this conversation. We're dealing with these bigger concepts that are actually, like, in a sense, archetypal. So coming back to our body, I'm extremely analytical. I am smart as fuck. I'm highly self-educated. I'm always reading. I'm always learning. I'm curious. But when it comes to actually processing, that is not always my best friend, because intellectually we can bypass the sensations in our body. We can override what our body is sharing, what our body is telling us. And from an intellectual standpoint, this is a really big disservice to actually processing. We can also, on the opposite end of the spectrum, we can get so involved in processing that the act of processing itself becomes a form of addiction, because we get sort of habituated to the state of flux and feeling like we're making progress when in reality we're sort of regurgitating the same issues, and actually a lot of the time re-traumatizing ourselves in the process of what we're processing. So how do you tell if you're actually building resilience or if you're just habitually kind of reharming yourself by getting yourself triggered, going into the trigger, doing the processing, and beginning the entire process over again? How you can tell is if in exploring that edge of discomfort, if you are actually still able to ground and are still able to sort of hold yourself within that state. This is one of the reasons why we work with other people. This is one of the reasons that people come to me, is because I practice at holding that state. I do my own work because I'm devoted to doing my work, but also from a greater, like, from a service orientation. I can't hold states for people that I can't hold within myself. And I have a history of abuse, mental, emotional, physical, psychological, sexual, myself, that I've worked very extensively to be able to hold that state, to be able to acknowledge. Even now, stuff still fucking comes up, and I've been doing this work for a long time. But what I can notice about how I'm actually building resilience with it instead of succumbing to the addiction of processing is that when it comes up, the trigger, it doesn't last as long. I'm able to see it more quickly for what it is. I'm able to still hold a state of regulation within myself, or if I don't feel that I can, I reach out to a friend or a counselor, to another practitioner, and I ask for support in creating that state of sustainability with my nervous system in particular. So what we're looking for is, we're not looking for like a perfect state of not ever being like emotionally affected by anything. That's fucking absurd. It's never going to happen. What we're looking for with doing processing work, and what we're looking for with building resilience, is that when we do get knocked off target, we are able to bounce back more. When we do find ourselves sort of slipping out of our regular, like, whatever has become sort of a more ingrained grounded track for us, when we slip out of that, we notice that we're able to come back more to it, that we don't slip as far, that we don't lose ourselves for as long or as badly. So it's like stretching a rubber band, and you come back to yourself, right? What tends to happen with people who, in particular when they're young or severely traumatized, is that process of resilience isn't built into them, because most of the time where the trauma really sinks in is the fact that when we were hurt, when we slipped into a state of shock, we weren't supported. We didn't actually have support. So what our nervous system did is it sort of set to that state, and it didn't have another state to recalibrate to. So Gabor Mate says that trauma is not only the act of being hurt or traumatized, it is the lack of support to put it into proper context and to be able to deal with it after the fact. So if we didn't have that, then we're less likely to be as resilient as adults, because we don't actually have another state that we naturally can orient to. So we kind of reorient ourselves to trauma. This is something that I've worked really fucking hard on. This is something that I feel is the underlying root of my own anxiety, that I feel is very often the underlying root of people's depression, that is also the underlying root of a lot of actual, physical ailments, as well as the emotional and psychological ones, because this entire process is still occurring through our bodies. So if we want to practice resilience, if we want to become more emotionally stable and sort of relationally more effective at communicating, we really need to familiarize ourselves with the sensations in our body. We need to recognize where we tend to go to when we don't feel stable, when we don't feel safe. Do you tend to get angry? Do you tend to want to run away? Do you tend to freeze? Do you tend to move into people pleasing? If you tend to move into people pleasing, like has been one of my habitual sets for a long time, sort of the need to fix situations and scenarios that may actually not need fixing, that becomes part of the neurological process of keeping that state active. And that's something that I've been in for a few days. I've been working on. I've been really looking at like if I didn't have this need to fix and sort of make sure things were okay, how would my nervous system feel? How would my body feel? What would I naturally be more oriented to doing, rather than sort of kind of obsessing about something that I may have said, or that something that I may have said to somebody, which is what I've been doing in this case. I feel like I brought shock into a really tender moment, and I'm like, how could you? That's so horrible. You fucked up your nervous systems. It's like, it fucking happens. It happens. If there is actual repair work that needs to be done, then we need to do the repair work. Very often, before we can make repairs with another person, we also need to do the repair work with ourselves. Hopefully, we can also learn to do repair work together. Like, that is the goal, I think, relationally. And I think that's one of the reasons why commitment is such a trigger for me, is because from a relational standpoint, that context for that word, commitment, has never actually really involved doing any kind of co-repair work. It wasn't something that I experienced a lot of in my childhood, just because I think my caregivers and parents just didn't have the level of presence and skillfulness to be able to do that. So it's something that I've had to learn really a lot later in my adult life. It's not something that was present in the majority of my romantic relationships. Very often, instead of, the care and the sensitivity being present, there was a level of denial and gaslighting, and that's just that's insult on top of injury. It doesn't actually create repair. Moving into the realm of talking about spiritual bypassing, people are telling you to let it go instead of holding space and sharing and engaging and relating. That's adding more insult to injury, and we do that to ourselves too. I wrote an article about this, white lighting and gaslighting, something or other, something toxic paintbrush to our relationships. I'll come back and drop the link. It's a good one. But really, in order to build resilience, we have to acknowledge what is there. We have to start by acknowledging what is here. And once we acknowledge what is here, we get an actual sort of concept, and we get an actual feeling and sense of what's really going on within us. Then we can address it. We really can't address what we can't feel. We really can't address what we won't see, what we won't look at. We really can't heal it. Mindset work does not fucking cut it. That's just us sort of trying to, with intellect and logic, sort of overcome these deeper somatic and underlying subconscious programs that aren't touched by mindset work. We need presence, like the energy that really sort of connects all of life, and that sort of can transcend even the archetypal realm, is this sort of dropped down, calm, engaged state of awareness. This is why people meditate, but we don't necessarily need to meditate to do that. We actually need physical body awareness and presence. So in order to engage in that state, we need to drop our shoulders, relax our jaw, soften our belly, breathe, move into a state of kind of first self-reassurance, like looking around, like, I'm safe right now, everything's okay, nothing's going on, nothing is like setting off alarm bells. We can't do this work when we're in a state of alarm. We just can't. So we breathe, we reassure ourselves. Then as we do that, we kind of establish that state. Then we have space to kind of look around and be like, okay, what are the sensations that are coming up? What are some thoughts that are coming up that want to be cared for? And whatever comes, we listen. We don't judge, we discern, we don't question whether it's valid. We just listen at first, right? And as we listen and we kind of practice that state, we can add in a state of questioning as well. Is this really true? Is this true now? Was this true at some point in my life and it's not true now? How can I be with what was once true and is no longer true for me? How can I offer care and really sense and feel into my needs in this moment? How can being present with my own needs allow me to be more present with others? And this is the process. This is how it becomes relational instead of just sort of intrapersonal. It becomes transpersonal. We recognize that in doing it for the benefit of ourselves, we also create benefit for other people. And as we can do that more effectively for ourselves and we can practice doing it with others, we get to build more and more resilience. So those are my kind of scattered evening caffeinated thoughts on this topic. I don't know if there isn't a lot of people watching or if you guys are quiet. Either way, that's okay. I usually invite people to leave questions and comments and engage in this conversation, but I feel like this one's kind of been a monologue, and that's okay. I'm going to keep it short in that regard, and I'm going to invite you to check out my website, illuminationwithjustice.com. I'm hosting a retreat in here in my hometown place in the wilds of Montana near Bozeman, September 17th through 19th. It's called Rewilding, Bringing Primal Wisdom to the Modern World. One of the reasons that these processes have become so unfamiliar to us is because a lot of us experience instinct injury when we're very young. So the lived and embodied experience of knowing ourselves, of really actually knowing our feelings, knowing what we're feeling, being in tune with our instincts gets disrupted and gets sort of socialized and intellectualized instead of being this sort of primal living responsive state within us. So this retreat, we're going to wake that back up, and we're going to do inner work. We're going to do team building exercises. We're going to go hiking. We're going to eat delicious food. We're going to play in the woods. We're going to get to know each other. I think this is like the ideal kind of setting to do this work, where you move into your center and you do so in a safe, loving, supportive, skillful environment. I'm skilled. I know what the fuck I'm doing. And I love it and I enjoy it. I'm happy to guide you through your process. And then the second part of that is actually taking what's happening in here and applying it out here, engaging with the outer world, talking and sharing and engaging with other people, and doing it in nature. I think provides this wonderful container of like providing a different level of neurological support as well. Not to mention, it's just going to be beautiful and fun. So I invite you to check that out. Check out my website, illuminationwithjustice.com. Check out my writer profile, elephantjournal.com/Justice Bartlett, to find out more information on me. And thanks for joining this conversation. If it's been beneficial, I invite you to share it with your friends, your family, your community. And I encourage you to be gentle with yourselves and to take care and have a beautiful day. Peace.